Today we're going to talk about composition and show some examples, both from nature, portrait, architecture, and travel that try to apply some of these techniques. But we'll also work through some examples of how do we get from just a straight ordinary snapshot to something that's better using these principles. So with that, let me share my screen and let's go into it. Okay, does everyone see this Mexican J?
Yes.
Trying to get trying to get a drink in the middle of, or just close to the Mexican border, actually. We'll talk about composition guidelines first, and then we'll touch on light. And obviously those two together help really make a picture. There we go. As we look at these guidelines, and they truly are guidelines, I mean, they aren't cast in stone by any means. One of the first guidelines is to try and have a clear subject. You know, the viewer should not have to try to figure out what it is you're trying to show them. You know, it should be pretty obvious. The snowy egret, the subject is very obvious. You know exactly what it is. That was taken at the Lincoln Park Zoo, by the way. If you're lucky enough to stand in front of a great subject, and as one photographer once said, the best way to take better pictures is stand in front of better subjects. This is Mount Rainier from Sunrise, Washington. And obviously, it's a great subject. It's hard to go wrong with something like this. But it could be something close to home. These are just mallard ducklings up here at Rollins Savannah. And I think they really make a pretty cute subject that tells a little bit of a story, a prodigal son or daughter out there. This one, the colors are beautiful. I love it. I often have it as a screensaver, but it does have one real problem to it. And that is there's no obvious subject in this other than the sunset and the colors. So while it's pretty, it really doesn't have a subject. So this makes a good background, but that's about it. Here's one where there's a lot of subject, and unfortunately, nothing really stands out to you. I did try to lighten up this one snow goose. This is at Bosque del Apache, and darken down a bit the others. You can only go so far because they do need to stay white, but even that didn't help. This one right here still doesn't stand out enough so that the subject is very clear. Now, if there was one that was different in this group, then that would have been a real focal point that you could use. But snow geese aren't like that. They all look pretty much the same. Of course, you could go a little crazy, try something like that. But now, what do you do with a subject once you've decided what you're going to use as a subject? Well, one choice is to stick it right in the middle. And for some photographs, that really works well. Architecture, putting the subject right in the middle and having symmetry around it can often be very, very effective. And in fact, more effective than going off center. I've noticed in competitions, the ones that tend to be centered in architecture often seem to do better than the ones that come in at an angle. But that's not always true. Sometimes they'll, the ones at an angle will be a different enough perspective that they really grab people. You can even get symmetry somewhat in nature. Oops, that's obviously some mute swans. This was taken up by McHenry Dean. With portraits, you can put the person right in the middle and it can work reasonably effectively. The subject's pretty ugly in this case, but other than that, it's a subject and it shows through as a portrait. But you can put the subject off center, and that's often more effective. The reason for it is that when you put the subject right in the middle, it tends to create a more static picture. And by having the subject off center, it makes the picture feel a little more dynamic. The balance is very different the visual balance is very different when you do that. And it creates, in some ways, a lot more interest. And in this case, you also get to see more of the background. Now, the backgrounds are blown out in this picture, so this isn't a perfect picture at all. But I think in this case, putting this particular subject off center makes it a better shot. Even with architecture, though, being off center can sometimes help. This one, I like it. I'm not sure that any judge in our competitions would like it, but this is the cathedral in Sevilla in Spain. The builders of the cathedral said they wanted to create something that people thought that they were insane to build something that gigantic and huge, and it really was something to see. Here in Cordoba, I didn't even try to go with a symmetrical approach. To me, a much more natural approach was to put this hallway off center so that you had the lines receding down like a perspective. And off center just seemed to be the natural approach for me to take this, as opposed to even thinking about doing one directly in the center. So you have that basic choice that you have to make. And if you decide to get it off center, how do you go about doing that? Well, I think everyone's heard the rule of thirds. And that basically says, put a tic-tac-toe square over your picture. And then the points of intersection on the tic-tac-toe grid, these 4 points are called power points. And they, if you can, make the primary portion of your subject either at these points or certainly on these lines, that creates a more pleasing balance. And so it's become almost like a gospel for photographers these days with the rule of thirds. It's built into a lot of our cameras on your LCD, even on a DSLR. When you're playing back the pictures, you can have a grid superimposed on it so you can see it. It's easy to visualize. All of us know what a tic-tac-toe grid looks like. And so you can, whether you've got one physically there or not, you can still imagine it and have it and try to line up your shot that way. If you've got a mirrorless camera, you can have it appear in your viewfinder as just a standard part of the picture. And in fact, I do. I keep it on all the time. Now, is the rule of thirds something that's cast in stone? Actually, no, it's not. And in fact, the rule of thirds is a simplification of an older grid that was used by artists before photography. If you go to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, which is their main museum for Dutch masters, the highlight of the museum is Rembrandt's The Night Watch, and that you see a picture of it in the background. Well, it looks like Rembrandt did not put his subject off center. This is what you see when you go to the Rijksmuseum. However, it turns out that when it was originally commissioned, this is what it looked like. But they later moved it to a new assembly hall, and the Burgermeisters at the time decided to make it fit in the new assembly hall. They needed to cut it off. So you see the parts on the outside of the white, that's where they cut it off. And it actually creates a very different feel by putting the two central subjects off center than it does when it's been cut down. So we have the Burgermeisters to thank for it. They didn't save the pieces. This is from a student who painted it contemporaneously at the time, and that's the only reason we know what the original actually looked like for the Night Watch. Now, if for some reason mine's advancing automatically, so I have to keep pumping it back. If we look at this and we put a rule of thirds over it, doesn't really line up that well. So it's kind of doubtful that Rembrandt used the rule of thirds when he was creating this. And in fact, the rule of thirds is just a bastardized form of the golden ratio grid line, which is shown here. And it's based on the golden ratio. The golden ratio is 1 to the, an aspect ratio of 1 to 1.618034 or something like that. Clearly, that's not too intuitive to us. So it's much easier for us to visualize something like the rule of thirds. But actually, it came from this originally, and it's just a simplified version of it. Now, it doesn't look as if Rembrandt used this one either. By the way, these grid lines, the way they're appearing in Lightroom, if you go to the crop tool and you press the letter O, you're in the develop module of Lightroom, and you press the letter O, it'll start showing you an overlay of grid lines. And if you continue pressing O, it'll flip through them in turn. And rule of thirds is one of them that it'll show you. The golden ratio, which is the one you see right in front of you now, is another one. Another one is called the golden triangle. And this starts to look a little closer to what Rembrandt may have used for his painting, as you can see. The way the painters are framed down in the lower triangle, and then the line going through with the guy in the red hat. And actually, if you, in Lightroom again, if you hold the shift key and then press O, it'll change the orientation of the grid. So if we do that, boy, this really looks like what Rembrandt may have used for his drawing, his painting rather, of the Night Watch. So these are ones that artists have used, in ages past. Clearly, when you're shooting, you can keep it in mind, but it's kind of hard to visualize some of this when you're shooting. These come into play more when you're cropping, if you want to use them. And again, only in Lightroom. I've tried looking in Photoshop. They don't have anything in native Photoshop, and I once saw some actions that would try and simulate this. It was really clumsy to use and not very adjustable, so I just threw it away. It wasn't worth it. But in Lightroom, it really does help when you're trying to do your cropping to go ahead and put up one of these grids and work with it, whichever one feels right for you. But certainly while you're shooting, you want to be keeping it in mind. So this is called the golden triangle, rotated this way. And there are still more that artists have used for, centuries. This one is called the golden spiral. And again, it's based again on those numbers we talked about before, that ratio. And in fact, this is actually based off the Fibonacci sequence, for those of you that are familiar with it. And again, by shifting doing Shift O in Lightroom, it'll move that focus point to the 4 corners. Mentally, what you can think of is that if you wanted to translate the rule of thirds into what were the grid lines for the golden ratio, these lines are just closer to the center. So that means you go a little closer to the center. If you want to think in terms of the golden spiral, these are a little closer to the corners than the rule of thirds grid will give you. So the rule of thirds, though, is a real simple and real good approximation, but just don't think of it as written in tablets of stone brought down from Mount Sinai, especially any judges in the audience. Now, if you feel there's a reason why you shouldn't use any of those, then, if you've got a good reason, do it. In this case, I wanted that rainbow, and I wanted those 2 birds, the 2 bigger birds up in the sky, clearly the one up in the upper left. For me, that meant I shortened down the amount of horizon down below. So it really doesn't fall along any of those grid lines at all. But to me, I wanted to do it for this purpose. Now, would judges in a competition agree with that? Yeah, maybe not, but that's life. Now, one of the things when you're shooting, especially landscapes, is one rule of thumb that is pretty well inoculated into all of us is keep your horizons out of the middle. Instead, pick either the ground to dominate or the sky to dominate, and make that take up at least 2/3. You know, in other words, the top third section should be just sky, or the top 2/3 should be sky. And you can actually go even further than that, as this one does, and it's into the top third with the ground. So in general, don't put your horizons in the middle. And again, if you put these into competition, that's almost certain death to do that. But there is an exception that everyone accepts for this. And that is if you have a reflection that is pretty big, you know, then a centered horizon is okay if you have a reflection. This is Sprague Lake out in Rocky Mountain National Park. And this is Mount Rainier again, taken from Reflection Lake in Mount Rainier. But if you can make it off center, it's still a better idea in general, you know, with a reflection. So here's a young pie-billed grebe taken down in Arizona. And again, I just felt it was better to have him more on the rule of thirds. And you notice with verticals, the same principles apply. Imagine your tic-tac-toe grid. I don't have one drawn in here, but as you can see, the head isn't at a power point. It's close, but not quite there. But it's certainly the duck itself is, the grebe itself is along one of those lines, more or less. And I can always retreat to saying, well, gee, I was actually using the golden ratio grid, or, you know, the golden spiral, get away with it. Okay, so that's the subject. We talked about the subject, make it clear, and then decide where you're going to put it. But the background ends up being just as important as the subject in many ways. And it can either help make, certainly be neutral, or ruin your picture. And one of the biggest considerations in general with your subject is to simplify it. This is a widow skimmer, and as you can see, it's taken with a telephoto lens, and although there are reeds, just like the reed being shown here, off in the distance, because they're off in the distance and it's telephoto lens, it blurs it out. And so you get this very nice, smooth background, and it's very simple, and it makes a very clean picture that way. Here's a typical snapshot. One of my grandsons. I have 15 grandchildren, so I get to use them a lot. And you know, it's a pretty terrible picture. It's just a snapshot. It's busy, it's cluttered. You see extra people in the background. You see overlap here between T and my son, Tom, in the background. There's a fire hydrant over here that's bright yellow. You've got all this junk going on. Okay, so not a very good shot. This one is better, less clutter, but you still have a couple of odd pieces that, you know, like this shadow coming in and this one diagonal line cutting across back. But clearly in this shadow here, but clearly a much better picture than the first one. And finally, if we try to remove even more of these background elements that are cluttering things, you know, you can get to something like this. And again, it's just like that widow skimmer we saw before. The background in this case is just totally blurred out. And so you're just focused on T, intently waiting for the pitch and batting. So, and it's that approach of, you know, starting with a snapshot, but then saying to yourself, well, how can I make it better? And thinking about simplifying your backgrounds that'll help you move through and get toward more of a shot like this, even with snapshots. Now, clearly, my focus was a little bit off here. It's focused more right on the edge of this helmet than his eyes. But thanks to Topaz Sharpen these days, I could fix that if I wanted to in post. I just haven't gotten back to these. Okay, Navy Pier, back in the old days, I guess this isn't there anymore, but there used to be a fountain right by the entrance. Again, more of my grandkids in the front. Typical snapshot. Not very good looking, kind of junky. Better, one subject, clear who it is. She's facing toward us now, so the pose is a little bit better. And so it's a cleaner picture. This one's even better. It's just more interesting. There are more people. They're doing some different things. One of them is looking right dead at us, Evelyn. And we also have this line here going across that's a diagonal and not a straight line, which makes it feel more interesting. And so by working the background and deliberately moving yourself, you can really make a dramatic change in a lot of these pictures and make them much, much better. And it's amazing how just moving yourself a few feet or up or down a little bit can really make a dramatic difference. And that's true sometimes, even if you're taking a landscape of mountains that are miles away, just because of the way the foreground and the background change when you adjust yourself. Picture of one of my granddaughters, Grace. And again, extra clutter in the background, base of the post in the right, the stuff over on the upper left, and here it's a cleaner shot. Now, if I only could find a way to make Grace smile, I'd be in good shape. This is her usual look. She's better these days. Pets at home, 2 Chihuahuas, one long-haired and one short-haired. Again, just some extra stuff. They're cute dogs, but you've got this baseboard here. You've got a pillow, I guess, over here. If we work at trying to simplify that a bit by just getting down lower, shooting up, a much, much cleaner shot. You don't see the baseboard, you don't see the stuff on the floor anymore. Instead, you just see the subjects with a limited amount of extra stuff, which adds interest to it, I think, and a much better picture. Also, by having them closer in and filling the frame more, you get greater impact as part of the process. A son and another grandson practicing down in the basement. Again, that's a certain amount of just stuff all over the place. But if you just move closer and make sure you position yourself so you don't have any of the junk that's on the wall showing. Or what I sometimes do when I go to my kids' houses is I'll go around and I'll just take things off the wall and I'll move furniture, just so I have a clean section of wall to take pictures at. And they're used to it by now, so they don't object to my doing it. Plus, they get to see the pictures. Another granddaughter. Not bad, but not all that good either. So what can we do to clean this up? Well, we've got the stuff at the bottom. The pose could be improved, and we could do something to get a little more impact. So this is close, but it's not quite there. This is a much better picture and a better pose too. Okay. So going from this, which is okay, to this, which is really, I think, of course, I know Natalie very well, and I think she's totally delightful. This really comes through in this one. Some more of my grandkids all packed in on a couch. In this case, there's this stuff in the upper right corner, and it's in the way. One thing I could do, I suppose, is try to move that stuff out or cover it up, but sometimes you don't want to spend all that time. So in this case, you just might, in post-processing, go and dodge it in, make it darker up there so that it's just not visible or not very visible. It doesn't interfere as well. And it makes for just a much better picture when you do that. Now, your backgrounds don't always have to be simple. This is a very complex background. It's a bunch of king penguins. The brown ones are the kids and the white and black ones are the adults. There's a bunch of them out there. And I actually deliberately created this shot that way. I literally hiked about a quarter mile just to get to a point where there was a ridge that I could get a family group up close, but have enough distance behind so that blurring away and out of focus would be the great mass of penguins that were sitting out there. And so to me, that makes a much, much better picture by having all of them back there. But you've got to make sure that they're subdued enough that they don't interfere with your main subject. And that included going in and reducing the brightness of some of the adults back there. So a complex background can work really well too, if it meshes in with the photo and it helps tell the story and tells the story of where you are and what's going on with it. And in fact, in my mind, that actually tells a much better story than if it was just a clean blank background of the sky or something like that. Here again, kind of a busy background. My granddaughter Zoe, the focus is clearly the bubble, but I think she adds a tremendous amount to it, and having her out of focus really helps a lot. So again, you notice the bubble is in the middle, left to right. It's obviously up about a third of the way. So in that sense, we are helping with the rule of thirds. But again, part of what you look for is visual balance on these things and visual weighting. Sometimes you want an empty space in one side to really show off what you have going on the other. And in this case, her hand is balanced by her, blurred in this case, with obviously the center point being the bubble. So again, don't treat the guidelines as absolute rules that you have to follow all the time. Visual weight and visual feel on it really makes a tremendous difference. And that's something that you will just have to work on yourself and also look at other photos to just see how other people do it. Filling the frame. Is it better to show more of the environment the way this one does, this loon? Or are you better off getting in close? Same picture, just cropped differently. The answer is, I don't know. This has more impact because it's more in your face. And again, when you look at competitions, the impact can help a lot. You know, when you're back off like this, you know, it may get a lower score just because of that. In the empty space or negative space, as we call it, around it. But it's very much a judgment call, and sometimes really hard to tell. You know, if you're in doubt, take it both ways, and then go ahead and decide later. Sometimes it's hard to decide later. Of course, with the modern cameras, we get such a high pixel count that we can take these pic shots and then we can crop them. And this was with an older camera, so you don't have the, again, this could certainly benefit from Topaz Sharpen. Again, back to grandkids. Okay, filling the frame more, though, makes it much better. So again, that filling the frame and making sure you've got it visually balanced more really makes a real difference with these photos. So you can do some of that, obviously, when you're cropping. But when you are cropping, a couple things you want to watch out for. One, try not to just barely touch the edge with something. You know, crop it more strongly or not at all. And try not to crop at a joint if you can for people and animals. It's just frowned upon. Portrait photographers tend to really nail you if, in fact, you chop it at a joint. And this one is a little weaker, the last one, but if you've got a diagonal, like branches, try not to run them directly to the corner, make it a little bit above the corner or a little bit below the corner. But again, sometimes it works going right on the corner if that's the way it works for the rest of the picture. So again, I wouldn't get too hung up on something like that. But let's look at an example of these, particularly the first one. Here, what should be a really nice eagle picture at Lock and Dam 14. But if you notice at the top wing touches the frame. And I've had a lot of shots ruined that way. You know, we always talk about filling the frame, and you've always heard the mantra, you know, I try to make it perfect in camera so that it doesn't, you know, I never have to do anything with it. But unfortunately, when you've got a lot of action going on like these are, and you don't have a static subject, you also lose a lot of shots because you don't get it quite perfect, okay? So in these situations, it is usually better to leave yourself a little space and then crop in a little. And in fact, in this case, that's what I did with this one. This one actually won first place in the first Stewards of the Mississippi Eagle photo contest, judged by the by all the viewers. Jim Botkin, in fact, won the Critics' Choice with a beautiful shot of in the middle of a snowstorm. Here's again that same family group that I showed you before, and kind of interesting. I had this in for a club critique at Riverwoods, and it one of the critiques was to leave a little more space at the top, a little more breathing room for them to go into. And actually, I'd cropped it this way just so I wouldn't show that bit of sky there. I just didn't think it would be worthwhile. But with that, I went ahead and recropped it and then submitted it to a competition where it got a rousing 23. I thought the picture was actually much better than the 23. I don't know how you give this thing a 7, but later we submitted it through to PSA, and where it did get an award, and then in their best of the year for the division we were in, took 3rd place for the year. So I guess I felt better about that. So I guess one of the stories lessons you can take away from that story is that, you know, don't let the competitions necessarily drive you too much. You can get really wrapped up in those things, but it's a bit random, and it's really tough because especially if you've got a lot of pretty good pictures going in, you know, it's almost a roll of the dice in some cases to pick out. I mean, clearly there are some differences that are pretty obvious and some that really stand out, but then you get to a point where, you know, who knows? You could almost flip a coin. Another thing to watch out for when you're working on your pictures is avoid bright spots. Clearly the sun in the lower left corner is a bright spot here. And what happens, of course, is your eye will travel to that bright spot. So it dominates the whole picture, and your eye goes there and you're lost. So if you can, try to do it in such a way that you eliminate that bright spot. And this is one way. This is actually a composite. It's a sandhill crane taken up here at Illinois Beach State Park, and then a sunrise or a sunset over at in the Badlands. Another way you can end up getting these highlights, if you notice the reflections in the leaves over on the left-hand side. These are called specular highlights because they're just caused by the sun speckling off of the leaves. And so you need to kind of work your way to get rid of those if you can. This is an elegant Trogon taken down in Arizona. Let's look at this one. A first grab shot to, you know, this is Nymph Lake up in Rocky Mountain National Park. One, the horizon just plain looks crooked, so this thing needs to be straightened. Remember, we talked about bright spots before. The bright blue right down here in the, you know, at the bottom of the photograph, it really draws your eye back there again and again and again. So that's not cool either. So what do you do when you've got something like this? Well, you try to see if you can move yourself a little bit and get rid of those distractions. Obviously, the horizon line you can get rid of when you're post-processing. But by taking my tripod, extending it all the way and putting the center post all the way, and then standing on a log myself, I was able to change the foreground and also create enough of a gap between this log and the reflection of the mountain peaks. So there had to be a gap there, and stand and stretch myself as far up as I could to get this photo of Nymph Lake. And it's a much better photo than this one. And I think you can see, just by thinking about these things and kind of working your subject a little bit more, you can make a big difference in terms of the quality of the photo that you're getting out of it. Do you do it vertical or horizontal? Cute story on this. Back when CACA was doing critiques before the actual meeting started, you could bring in some pictures and have someone from CACA give you feedback on it. And in fact, Rich, you were the one that gave me feedback on this. You said you liked the picture, but you thought it might be a lot better if I cropped it vertically and and just cut the tail. But as you told me at the time, don't cut the tail a little bit, definitely cut it. So it's very deliberate. So people know that this wasn't the way you shot it, but you actually cut it. So I did that, and I put it in a competition, and it got a good score. I asked for a critique on it by the judges afterwards, and one of the judges says, well, I really like the picture, but I wish the tail wasn't cropped off. So here again, always take all of this with a grain of salt, because you're going to get just different opinions, and people are going to like different things. And so just accept that as part of the due course of nature. And in the end, the one you have to satisfy is yourself. So you clearly want to get the feedback and adjust things that you think make sense based on that feedback, but don't get hung up on it. You would think landscapes should be landscape. This is again Reflection Lake at Mount Rainier, and seems like a natural landscape, right? But it's actually more powerful in this case as a vertical, as a portrait, because you get a foreground, you get a midground, and you get a background that really stand out in the vertical shot. Now this was taken as an HDR and obviously darkened down some in the foreground to get this look. But when you're taking landscapes, clearly that's one of the techniques that you can use a lot, which is to have something in the foreground. And we saw that with some of the other examples before, like that one of Sprague Lake, if you remember that, where there's a rock there. And the reason for the rock is to give you a foreground object to go with. Oh, here it is. Sorry about that. I forgot we had it right next. So again, position myself. There were several places I could position myself, but I end up just going right back to this one spot all the time, simply because that's where the rocks were. And I could place them in an appropriate place right here in the foreground, not dead center, but off to the corner more. Here again, a foreground, a foreground, a midground, which is the town, and then the background, which are the stars at night. This is taken at the Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado. I forget the name of the town that's in the distance. So having that gives you a lot of more depth in your picture, and your eye can travel through it from the foreground to the mid to the background and then back again. And it makes a more interesting picture by far, but certainly it's the feeling of depth. And here again, you get a feeling of depth with this, taken in Iceland at the Diamond Beach, where the glaciers break up and come through. And obviously this was taken with a slower shutter speed, and you have to time it so the water comes up and then starts receding at you in order to get this kind of an effect. I have this one in my living room on a canvas. Looks nicely. Interior decorators will tell you that odd numbers are better than even. So If you can get odd numbers, great. Go for it. But, and what that means is if you've got a lot of choices, try to pick out things where they're in groupings that are odd. So in this case, I could have gotten 4 of them in, but I decided I wanted to go with 3 just because it's an odd number. But if you need to shoot 2, because there's only 2, then one technique that can help is if you can make one of them more dominant in some way than the other one. So with these 2 common loons, clearly the one on the left is more dominant than the one on the right. And then again, the theory behind it, or the rationale I've heard before on it, is if they're too similar, your eye just kind of ping pongs and bounces back and forth between the 2. It doesn't know where to really rest and sit. And again, you've got to watch these rationalizations. And I've been throwing out a decent number of them as I've gone through, because one thing I've concluded a long time ago is the thing we are absolutely best at as human beings is rationalizing anything. So we can make up a story that'll explain anything that we want, including the results of the recent elections. So one thing to look for, if you can find it, are leading lines. And this was in Scotland at low tide in an estuary. And, there's just a lot of territory there. But looking through by binoculars or naked eye, I saw this S-curve of a little bit of a channel in the estuary. And again, this thing goes on to the right and to the left and back a bit. But a leading line like that, especially a curved one, is a real grabber. I mean, that's something you look at and say, okay, let's see if I can make a picture out of this. And so that black-headed gull down there was a real bonus. Again, as a focal point that your eye could come back to and rest. So if that gull wasn't there, this would be a definitely weaker picture than having the gull there. And if you went up a little bit further, where you can't see it over this picture, it was really bright. And by cutting that out, again, what did we do? We tried to eliminate some really bright spots. The top is still brighter than the rest of it, but if I showed you the uncropped version, it would be much brighter up at the very top. Again, leading lines. This is North Avenue Beach, obviously in Chicago. And the pier itself makes a very nice curve going through. And then the shadows of the buildings as they come down make a leading line going up to the skyscrapers, the Hancock Building and the others. And so they really lead your eye right up to the central focal point of the photo. So leading lines, if you just walk up, you could take a picture and it would be a nice snapshot. But if you look for these lines, and if you see them, use them, that's how you can get a better composition. This isn't a great picture, but again, it's a leading line. So, take it. Another leading line. Helps frame. Again, 2 more of my grandchildren. Lots of grandchildren. Sometimes, even if there isn't a leading line, you can try to simulate one or create one. So this is Volo Bog, and when the tamaracks turn golden at dawn. And this was a little promontory on it, but I wanted to create a leading line going up here. So I artificially did that by basically darkening here at the lower right corner, the lower right section, and above it too, so that, can you see Rich, can you see my cursor going through here?
Yes, I can.
Okay. By having this section be a little lighter, it actually creates kind of a leading line going up to these tamaracks here. And so it's kind of a self-created leading line, if you like. And again, it's subtle, but I think it adds something to the picture. And again, those are things you try to do to take advantage of some of these techniques. Consider when you're taking pictures, changing your perspective. With wildlife in particular, it helps to get low. So for this snowy egret taken on the beach in Florida, I was on my knees, taking this picture. Sometimes you have to get very low. These are spring beauties. They stand about an inch above the ground. So basically, there was a small rise, and I was lying down on my belly trying to take these in order to get this shot. If I just took it standing up in our usual position, going straight down, it would just be a very, very different picture. And I don't think it would have been anywhere near as enjoyable as I like this one. And again, you can see it's off-centered. You can kind of draw out the rule of thirds. In fact, this is the one we used for that rule of thirds example earlier. Not a great picture, but the perspective from here, I got that by lying down and taking it. Obviously at Yellowstone. My wife took this picture. She was laughing so hard, I thought the picture would probably come out blurry on her side. But, again, just go for those different perspectives to give you a little bit different angle. And as we said before, for landscapes in particular, even though a mountain range can be far away, just by moving up or down a few feet or left and right a few feet, you can change the foreground dramatically. And the relationship between your foreground and the mountains in the background, even though the mountains are miles away. So it really is worth moving around a bit. If you come to a place where there's an iconic shot, take the iconic shot, right? And then after you've gotten that in the bag, then go look around for maybe some different angles or perspectives that you can take. And you might come up with a more unique picture, a little different picture than others have taken. And as with leading lines, if you see something where there's some really interesting color or a really interesting pattern or some real texture, those may be makings of a good picture. So if you see those, look to see if you can incorporate them into a striking picture. So color, for example, I don't know who was doing it, must have been for an ad, but again, in Iceland, they had a zodiac and we're setting up this lit tent out on the ice. I figured, boy, red against blue, this is wonderful, right? So got to take the picture. And actually, I had to talk the leader into putting his principles aside to just go ahead and take a picture of the darn thing. Because again, you don't get opportunities like that often. So make a picture out of it if you can. And who knows, this won an award at CACA. And so, you get awards out of it. Granddaughters again, with bright pink jackets, well, live it up. In fact, I was watching a travel photography webcast by John Gringo. And he said the first time he and his bicycling buddies went out, they had the usual black jackets and black shirts and everything else that we photographers always use. And as they took selfies, they just kind of blended into everything and they looked like a black hole. So they made a point on their next trip of going out and getting some very nice bright red or bright pastel colors to be wearing for t-shirts and jackets so that they really did show up well. So that's, again, something you think about beforehand if you can, or if you just see it, take advantage of it. Obviously, red is always a grabber, so you want to grab it. And in my defense, this is my granddaughter Zoe. She is not doing a handstand here, so this is totally legal. The operator of the the barrel didn't think so, but that's okay. Obviously, we looked at this one already, an elegant Trogan with that red breast, man, and the red berries that he likes to feed on. Red, oh boy, you just have to love it, especially when there's green around too, with complementary colors. So complementary colors can really bring things out. This is a Anna's hummingbird, and again, I took a lot of pictures of this hummingbird, but certain ways that he turned his head, just brilliant colors. And so take advantage of it. So in their case, I just stood there and he was at the top of a stalk. And as he just turned his head and moved around, I just kept taking pictures. And then culled it out later to get these. The colors don't have to be this bold and vibrant, though, to be really interesting and worthwhile. This is just a plain old mallard, but they're gorgeous. They're absolutely gorgeous. And this is up at Volo Bog. And that green in his head is just beautiful. And then the subdued colors around it, I think, really complement the green very well. That can be a really nice thing. So again, as you look around and you see things, I mean, you could shoot a whole bunch of things, but if you see color, you see texture, you see leading lines, you know, take a look at it and see if you can make a good picture out of it. The quad at the University of Washington, again, the colors aren't super grabby, but that pink is pretty neat, but just gorgeous. Color can really add so much to it. And this is, oops, down in the Tetons. Gee, I forget the name of this spot. Everyone, oh well, this is a favorite spot of photographers. There must have been 60 photographers all lined up at sunrise taking their shot.
Oxbow Bend.
That's right, Oxbow Bend at the Grand Tetons. Yeah, thanks. And these are very subtle pinkish kind of colors. You know, it's not, you know, it's dramatic red, but again, it really adds a lot. Patterns, again, this is down at Lincoln Park, Stairway in France. This is the Tiffany Dome down in the Cultural Center. This is in Cordoba, the Roman Bridge. All these create patterns that can be interesting in and of themselves. So they're worth taking a picture of. Olive grove trees, all arranged in nice lines. Texture can be something that can come out and grab you too. Obviously, this is pretty dull. The one black rock gives you something. Great Sand Dunes National Park, a lot of texture in that. And of course, lights and shadows. And old Roman waterworks in Cordoba. Again, just the texture in those old rocks, these several century old rocks, is just gorgeous. And it said to you, you know, you got to find a way to make this into a good picture. Whether this is or not, you have to decide, but I liked it. Scotland, again, the texture of the bridge and the rocks. Here, red against the rocks and the green coming down. This is not a great picture, but you know, the texture in the rocks, again, just attracted me. These are northern fulmars nesting, again, in Scotland. And here again, texture, certain amount of color. It just said, find a way to take a picture of me somehow. You may get situations where you get texture and color and patterns all together, and you get that sometimes with, particularly with the Arab mosques. Or you can say the heck with color and go monochrome. And that really shows pattern and texture and shape. And particularly if the colors are distracting, the image is really high contrast, this, you know, it's harsh light, monochrome can be a real savior in that case. And of course, as I think pretty much all of you know, the way to do it is you take a color picture and in post-processing software, you make it monochrome and you use those colors to adjust the tonality, the brightness or darkness of the different colors to create the effect that you want. And you can get some wildly dramatic different effects in black and white just by fiddling with how the colors are translated in it. We had a black and white group in Lake County Camera Club, and we'd take the same picture, and there were about 6 or 7 of us, and we would all post-process it ourselves, and then we compare the results. And it was amazing how different some of the results were for the same picture. So you can really do something. If you have trouble visualizing what it'll look like in mono, because we don't shoot mono that often. If you're shooting raw, you can set the picture style to mono. It'll still capture raw color, but it will show you the JPEG in your LCD when you view it will be monochromatic. And so if you're going out and you're deliberately trying to do some mono work, that might be a good trick to use so you can see it at the time and decide, are you hitting it the way you want? You're really getting, again, you're looking for those textures and the shapes and differences in tonality to try and make a difference. So here's a picture of Mount Baker in Washington State, and it looks good in color. I like this picture. I think it's just lovely. In black and white, it's the closest to Ansel Adams that I'll probably ever come. And I think it makes an even better black and white than it did in color. Portraits obviously can be really nice in black and white. This is my granddaughter Zoe again. I told her she looks like Mona Lisa in this. She's texted me back and said, I am not Mona Lisa. A church in Colorado on the way to Rocky Mountain National Park. Again, the color was actually kind of distracting here. Black and white really, I think, brought out the texture, the different textures, and the feel of this much better. And a loon. I like both the color version of this and the black and white. And again, it's almost like flipping a coin. Okay, we talked a lot about different principles of composition, but we should never forget that light is really critical as well. So you need the composition, but you also want to try and get the best light you can. And what are we looking at? We're looking at the quality of light and the direction of the light as well. Golden hour, sunrise, sunset, times just around that, with side lighting is just gorgeous. And again, Mount Rainier from a different side. It really brings out shadows. The shadowing really brings out texture. It just makes a much more dramatic, interesting picture. This is a golden hour portrait of, again, one of my grandkids. And the light is just gorgeous light. It's just really pretty. Midday, you tend to have harsh light. This is indigo bunning, and you have strong shadows. And again, just harsh light. You have specular highlights and light there. But it can be worthwhile for some shots. And so don't just give up in the middle of the day. Although the best times are still morning and night, early morning and night. Open shade, if you've got harsh light, can be the answer and the savior in many cases. Get something in the shade, and then you can, the light is much more even. You don't have the shadowing, heavy shadowing going on, and the heavy contrast. So this hummingbird down in Ecuador, really, you get to see the colors much better by having it be an open shade. Overcast diffuse lighting the sky acts like a giant softbox. This is off our back balcony, Baltimore Oriole standing on a bowl full of sugar water. And to get the white background, I took a sail from a sailboat and I draped it on the table and the railing, and then put the bowl on top of it. And of course, that just fades away. You don't see all the wrinkles in it. And essentially, you've got a studio portrait of a Baltimore Oriole. It was live and moving. It was wild, obviously. And also that overcast light is great for flowers. And it really lets you bring out the details and the colors very well with it. Backlighting, especially for flowers, can be terrific. And also can be for wildlife as well, but it's tricky. It can also look very crappy if you use backlighting. So, it's absolutely worth trying, but you've got to be kind of careful with it because you can end up with something that just doesn't look very good. But having that rim light really can add something to it. But you may have to supplement the front either with flash, or in this case, I use post-processing to try and bring out the detail. Again, more of a backlight rim light for a portrait, and it produces just a very different look and effect than straight flat lighting. And always remember that light things tend to push forward visually in your picture, and dark things recede. So as you remember with that Rembrandt painting, the Night Watch that we looked at before, his main subjects were bright. He really had spotlights on them, in effect. And the others were darker and they receded back. It was clear who were the subjects in those cases. who are the main characters and who are the supporting characters. When we talk about flash, somebody's unmuted. Greg, do you have a question? No? Okay. Flash can be a really good tool, but it can be really ugly. The typical flash we use on smartphones or on our cameras just comes out way, way too harsh. But if you use flash exposure compensation, you can really tone it down and make things blend in much better with the ambient light. So by all means, if you're going to use supplemental light, use that flash exposure compensation. In this case, this needs fill flash. The shadows are just way too dark. It's just too heavily contrasted. And this is with fill flash. And it just makes a better picture by a long shot. And so, would you rather have this one or would you rather have this one in your family album to look back in years later? Outdoors, again, you can use fill flash to really good effect because the sky is really bright. And so your natural metering off your camera will leave your main subject very dark with all that light behind them. But having a fill flash in front really makes it a much better picture, a much more balanced picture and visually much more interesting. Sometimes when you're shooting in a dense rainforest, the background will go to black on you with your ambient light if you're shooting with a fast enough shutter speed. And your flash in effect becomes the main light. So this is a green thorntail, again, down in Ecuador. Instead of flash, of course, you can use a reflector. In this case, I was traveling to one of my kids' houses, so I didn't have one with me, but I knew I was going to be taking some pictures. So I went out and I bought just a plain piece of foam core, and I covered it with aluminum foil that my daughter had for cooking and used it as a reflector. And that, again, basically made the shadows coming through from the window less harsh and smoother. So that's the end, and that's a quick run through of some composition guidelines and the importance of light and ways in which you can manipulate it. And even with nature shots, you can do some controlling of the light. You can take something and have the light coming from the side instead of right behind you with a flatter look by moving. If you're, for example, taking a bird, sometimes you can move to the side and get more of a side light out of it as opposed to flat front light. Okay, I realize that was a quick run through, but there's a lot to composition, and we didn't cover everything. Obviously, as you get to this more, you get more into things like visual balance and negative space and how you balance it out to create more dramatic photos. But I think this gives us a start. Any comments or questions? I'm going to stop sharing.
Hey, Mike, thanks for the presentation. It was good, really good. I was wondering how you removed the spectral highlights in your picture with the leaves.
Yeah, I did it in Photoshop. I didn't submit it through the nature competition for that portion of it. It's nice being in two camera clubs. Riverwoods is strict nature, and Lake County Camera Club is, anything goes. And so when I go through in Photoshop and I just clone out the specular highlights by substituting green in there, I submit that through Lake County. So that one was strictly Photoshop. Yeah. Now, one thing I could have tried, if possibly, was changing where I was physically by moving more to the side, so the light was coming in at a different angle. But in that case, I was on a road photographing off the road, and I really had limited flexibility. So, and plus, I didn't know how long that program was going to stick around, so I had to get my shots in when I could.
Right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What was on the back of the penguins?
The reason the adults are still there is they're molting. And so those were feathers. Those are molting feathers. And again, the judge commented on those, what's that stuff on there? That just takes away from the picture. And yeah, if you look at it from a purely idealized standpoint, it does, but that's nature. That's the way it is. So I guess I don't have a problem with it. And the rules don't allow you to clone those out if you're using strict nature.
I wasn't complaining about them, I'm just curious as to what they were.
Yeah, no, I complained about the comment, but that's okay.
I wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed this, and thank you for the presentation.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
I learned a lot.
Very well done.
Oh, thank you. I know a lot of this is really basic for some of you. I mean, some of you, know this just as well as I do. And you could teach this class just as easily.
Mike, it was very good. And my only comment about critiques is they give you ideas to think about, not necessarily things to do. But
Right.
Another way to look at it.
Yeah, definitely. I love getting the critiques. And, I do change things based on what I hear sometimes. But again, you've got to filter it through what you feel is right and what you're willing to do.
Oh, yeah. I always look at different views and say, do I like this one better or that one better?
Yeah, right, exactly. And I even picked on you there for a while, Rich.
I know. If you got something out of my advice, you got more than your money's worth.
Yeah, that's right.
So Mike, is it safe to say you're not going to be plucking your penguins from now on?
You're right. I won't be plucking those penguins. No.
I don't think you need to. It's a beautiful image.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites, and I've used it in different venues several times. So I'm overusing it at this point.
Do you mind taking a question that's a little off of the composition subject?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, you did mention the Topaz sharpening software, and I've been using that for a few months, but I'm wondering if most people use that as a plugin, or do more people use that as a standalone and then pull their photographs in to work on it?
I can just tell you how I use it. And basically, I always run it from either Lightroom or Photoshop. And most of the time, I'm actually doing it from Photoshop because at that point, I'm really going to be fiddling with that picture a little bit more because it takes a certain amount of time to run it through those filters. So what I'll do is I'll take it in Lightroom, I'll bring it into Photoshop, I'll duplicate my background layer, and then on that, I'll run the Topaz as a filter and change that layer. Which then if I know that I'm much happier with it than my background and I don't have to do any blending or anything else like that, a lot of times I'll just merge that down and then throw in an empty layer to just label it to say that I've applied it. So my file size isn't doubled, but that's how I typically work it.
Okay, so the reason that I asked that question is when I run it as a plugin from Photoshop, it takes, and I've got probably a 4 or 5 year old computer, but it takes a minute or so for Topaz Sharpen to come up. I mean, to actually run. I work on one picture, and then when I tell it to make those changes back in Photoshop, then the Topaz software closes down, and then I have to do it all over again for the next photo. Is that the way that it's supposed to work, or am I doing something wrong?
No, that's the way it works. It helps if you get a newer, faster computer with a really good graphics card.
Okay, hold that thought. Let me go get my wife.
Sure.
Greg,
Bring her over and I'll put in a plug for you. But no,
Thank you.
and that's why you don't run it on every single picture. Basically, you only run it on the ones where you think it really, you're going to do something with the picture and it matters to you.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Greg, it helps to have more memory too. That may be your limit.
Okay. And when you say memory, you're talking about the RAM
Yeah,
memory.
how much are you running?
Yeah, I'd have to look, Rich. I'm sorry.
And check your Photoshop settings, and Photoshop's not eating up all the memory.
Okay, I'll do that.
Also, one thing to watch too is that although it won't help you in the startup and close down that much, you can choose to have it automatically use either your graphics card memory or your CPU for rendering. And if you've got a good graphics card, that's actually the better route to go. In that case, the graphic card memory actually makes a difference. I'm running a gamer PC with a really good graphics card, so that really helps speed it up quite a bit.
Okay, after using that for months, I just ran into that option, those settings, just a couple of nights ago, and that, in switching from the CPU to the graphics card, I mean, that made a world of difference. So I did just
it
discover
really
that.
can. Yeah, it really can. And sometimes you get it set the wrong way by mistake or who knows how. And it really can make a big difference.
Thank you.
Sure.
Also, make sure you have the latest version of the software. They've improved speed dramatically recently.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions before we call it a day? Well, great. Well, thank you for sticking around, guys.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks again for the great presentation.
Okay, well, you're welcome, Rich.
Okay, in the recording, and this will be posted on the Garden website at some point, I hope.